Welcome back to our channel. Here is our new story.
I want to start with the moment that broke everything, because once you hear what my wife said to me, you'll understand why I stopped being her husband and started being something else entirely. She didn't scream it. She didn't say it in a fight. She said it the way you'd read a legal document out loud. Calm. Final. Like she'd been waiting to file it for years. And that's honestly what made it so devastating. My name is Callan. I'm 39. I manage operations for a logistics company outside Columbus, Ohio. I have 2 kids I'd walk through fire for, a mortgage I've been carrying mostly alone, and until 7 months ago, I had a wife I thought was my partner. Turns out I was her infrastructure. I just didn't know it yet. Let me give you the background, because this story doesn't make sense without it. Brielle and I met when I was 26 and she was 23. Mutual friends, backyard cookout, summer evening. She had this presence that was hard to ignore. Funny, sharp, full of ideas, the kind of person who talks and people lean in. I was different. I was the guy with a 5-year plan and a spreadsheet for the household budget. She thought that was grounding. I thought her energy was everything I was missing. We balanced each other out, or at least that's what we told ourselves. We got married. Nolan was born when I was 30, and 2 years later came Tessa. Nolan is 7 now, quiet and observant. The kind of kid who notices the temperature of a room the second he walks in. Tessa is 5, all warmth and movement, always looking for someone to hold her hand. Those two are the whole reason I kept everything together as long as I did. Here's where things started shifting, and I want to be precise about this because it didn't happen overnight. Brielle got into what she called personal development maybe 4 years into our marriage. Books, podcasts, journaling, fine. But then it evolved into something bigger in her mind. She started doing online mentorship consultations, building what she called her personal brand, positioning herself as a guide for conscious living and intentional mindset work. She went to retreats. She networked with other coaches and creators. She talked about her mission constantly. And her income from all of this? Some months a few $100s. Most months nothing that made a real dent. But that wasn't even the core problem. The core problem was that as her identity expanded, her presence in our actual household shrank. And I covered for it. Every single day. Let me be specific because I think vague complaints are easy to dismiss. My morning started at 6. I packed Nolan's lunch, made sure Tessa's outfit was sorted because she had strong opinions about that even at 4 years old, and I dropped them both at school before driving 40 minutes to the office. I managed a team, handled vendor contracts, solved problems that came in faster than I could resolve the previous ones. Then I picked the kids up, helped with homework, made or picked up dinner, handled bath time, handled bedtime, responded to school emails, scheduled the pediatric checkups, remembered the permission slips, fixed the things around the house that quietly broke, ordered the groceries, dealt with the insurance calls. Brielle, during this same stretch of time, was usually on a coaching call, working on her content, or what she described as protecting her energy after a long day. I need to be clear, she wasn't a bad mother. She loved the kids. But love and presence are different things, and the daily weight of keeping this family functional had shifted almost entirely onto me. And here's the part I'm most embarrassed about. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was a phase. I told myself she was building something and it would balance out. I rationalized it the way I rationalize operational problems at work, as temporary friction on the way to a better outcome. I kept waiting for the balance to return. It never did. By last spring, the house had gotten quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not peaceful quiet. Hollow quiet. Brielle and I barely talked about anything real. When I tried to open a real conversation, she'd either give me half her attention while the other half was on her phone, or she'd redirect into something about her inner growth and what she was working through spiritually. She stopped asking about my work completely. Not occasionally forgot, just genuinely stopped. There was no warmth between us anymore. We'd get through the kids' bedtime and then exist in separate corners of the house until we went to sleep. One night, I noticed Nolan watching us during dinner. Just watching, back and forth, like he was reading something. That image stuck with me. Kids know. They always know. I kept moving anyway, because that's what I do. And then came the night everything became undeniable. It was a regular weeknight in October. I had a rough day, a vendor situation that took most of the afternoon to untangle. I picked up the kids, made dinner, got them through their bedtime routines. By the time I finally sat down, it was close to 10. Brielle was at the kitchen table with her laptop, headphones halfway on, in her own world as usual. I sat across from her and I said, "Hey, can we actually talk tonight? Like really talk?" She closed the laptop slowly. She took the headphones off, and she looked at me with this expression I hadn't seen before. Not irritated, not sad, just settled. Like she'd already had this conversation in her head 100 times and was finally ready to have it out loud. She said, "Callan, I think we've been avoiding this for too long. I don't experience you as my partner anymore. I experience you as a co-parent. We run a household together. That's real and I respect it. But that's what this is." I sat there for a moment. I asked her how long she'd felt that way. She said, "If I'm being honest, a few years. A few years. Not a rough patch. Not since a specific argument. Years." I told her I needed some air. I went out to the back porch and I sat there in the dark for a long time. And I want to describe what was actually happening inside me during that hour, because it wasn't a dramatic breakdown. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of finally seeing something clearly that had been blurry for a long time. Like your eyes adjusting in a dark room, and slowly the shapes become real. I went back inside. She had gone to bed. I sat alone in the living room, and I started going back through everything with fresh eyes. Every time I asked if we were okay and got a non-answer. Every comment that subtly placed her on a higher plane than me, more evolved, more aware, more something. Every school event I attended solo. Every morning I handled the kids while she slept in to restore her energy. Every time I reached for connection and found nothing there. I had been the foundation of this family. Foundations don't get celebrated. They just hold the weight. And sitting there alone at 2 in the morning, I made a decision. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. She had defined what I was to her. Clearly. Calmly. So I decided to take her at her word. If I was just the co-parent, the functional housemate, the operational piece of the household, then that's all I'd be. Exactly that. Nothing more. No warmth she hadn't earned. No effort toward a connection she'd already closed. No more trying to be enough for someone who had quietly moved on years ago. I wasn't going to chase. I wasn't going to perform. I was going to become precisely what she said I already was. And what happened next, she never saw coming. The morning after she said it, I woke up before my alarm. 6 o'clock, same as always. I got up, made Nolan's lunch, got Tessa's clothes ready, made breakfast for the kids. Brielle came downstairs around 7:30, poured herself coffee, and looked at me like she was waiting for something. Waiting for the tension, maybe. Waiting for me to bring up the night before. I didn't. I handed Tessa her juice, told Nolan to grab his backpack, and said, "Okay, guys, let's go." That was it. I drove the kids to school, and I remember Tessa singing something to herself in the back seat and thinking, this is what I'm here for. This right here. Not the marriage. Not Brielle's approval. This. When I got to the office that morning, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going in. And I made a list in my head. Not an emotional list. A practical one. What do I actually need to figure out? Finances. The house. The kids' routines. Legal options. I'm an operations guy. When something isn't working, you don't keep running the same process and hoping for a different output. You redesign the system. So that's what I started doing. At home, the change was quiet but immediate. I stopped asking Brielle how her day was. Not out of cruelty, just because it was no longer my role, by her own definition. I stopped showing interest in her projects, her clients, her content ideas. When she talked about a retreat she was considering, I just said, "Sounds like something to think about," and went back to what I was doing. Conversations between us became strictly logistical. Who's picking up Nolan? Tessa has a checkup Thursday. The water bill is due. That's it. The warmth I had given automatically for years, I simply stopped giving. And at first, she didn't even notice. She was busy with her world. But after about 2 weeks, something shifted in her energy around me. She started showing up in rooms I was in more often. She started volunteering information I hadn't asked for. One evening, she came into the kitchen while I was helping Nolan with a science project, and she leaned against the counter and said, "You seem different lately." I looked up and said, "Just focused." And I went back to the project. Nolan glanced at me for a second with those quiet eyes of his, and then looked back at his worksheet. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he noticed the temperature had changed. Around that same time, I called a family law attorney. Not because I had made a final decision yet, but because I needed to understand my position clearly. I needed to know what the realistic picture looked like regarding the house, the kids, the finances. What I learned in that first consultation reframed a lot of things for me. I had been the primary earner for the entirety of our marriage. I had documentation of that. I had also been the primary caregiver in terms of day-to-day logistics, and my attorney told me that courts look at that. Not just who earns the money, but who shows up to the school events, who handles the medical appointments, who is listed as the emergency contact. I was all of those things. Brielle was present, but on paper and in practice, I was the operational parent. I started quietly keeping records, not in a dramatic way, just noting things. Who took the kids to their appointments? Who attended the parent-teacher conferences? Who responded to the school emails? I had years of this already in my inbox without even trying. The picture it painted was clear. Meanwhile, I started reclaiming time that I had quietly surrendered over the years. I picked up a woodworking project I had abandoned in the garage, something I used to love before family life swallowed every free hour. I started calling old friends I had let drift. One Saturday, I arranged for my mom to watch the kids for the afternoon and drove 2 hours to have lunch with my college roommate Derek, just because I wanted to. I didn't explain myself in detail. I just made it happen and went. That Saturday felt like oxygen. When I got home, Brielle was unusually quiet. Later that night, she knocked on the door of the home office where I was working and asked where I'd been. I told her I want to see Derek. She stood there for a moment and said, "You didn't mention it." And I said, "I didn't think I needed to." The silence after that said more than either of us did. She wasn't used to this version of me, the version that didn't orbit her, the version that didn't need her to validate his weekend plans. And I could see it unsettling her in small ways. She started being nicer at dinner, more present with the kids when I was in the room, as if she was performing something. She made a comment one evening about how we should maybe check in with each other more. I said, "Sure, if there's something specific you want to discuss, let me know." And I left it there. I didn't chase the conversation. I didn't open the door wider. A few weeks into this new dynamic, Tessa started asking me more often to read to her at night. One evening she said, "Daddy, are you and Mommy mad at each other?" I sat with that for a second. I said, "No, buddy. We're just being grown-ups. But I'm always here, okay?" She nodded and pulled her blanket up. Those moments with her and Nolan were the only ones where I let my guard fully down. Everything else I kept controlled and clear. About 6 weeks after that night in October, I was in the kitchen early in the morning and Brielle came down before the kids were up. She poured her coffee and then she sat at the table and she said, "Callan, I think I said some things that came out wrong. I want to talk about it." I looked at her and I said, "I heard you clearly the first time. I'm not confused about what you meant." She started to say something else and I said, "I've got to get the kids' lunches together." And I turned back to the counter. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. Because here's what I had figured out by that point. That conversation in October wasn't a mistake or a bad moment. It was the truth coming out of a person who had been telling herself a different story for years. And once you hear the truth, you can't negotiate it back into something softer. The confirmation came on a night I wasn't looking for it. Brielle was on a call in the living room, and I came downstairs quietly to get a glass of water. She didn't hear me come in. She was talking to someone, laughing, and I caught the tail end of it. She was describing our household arrangement as honestly working pretty well, and saying she had more freedom than most people in her situation. She wasn't talking about a client. The tone was different. The comfort in her voice was different. I stood there for a moment. Then I went back upstairs. I didn't need to hear more. That was the confirmation I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. She wasn't confused about what she had built here. She wasn't struggling with the state of our marriage. She was comfortable. She had a man handling every functional piece of her life, covering her financially, raising her children, maintaining her home, and she had enough personal freedom to build whatever identity she wanted around it. She had structured exactly what she needed and called it a marriage. And I had let her. Not anymore. I picked up my phone that night and I texted my attorney. I told him I was ready to move forward. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, I slept through the entire night. I filed in the second week of January. My attorney had everything organized. The financial records, the documentation of who handled what with the kids, the household contribution breakdown. It wasn't complicated on paper. What made it complicated was that I had to hand Brielle a document that made everything real in a way that a quiet kitchen conversation never could. I came home on a Thursday morning while the kids were at school. Brielle was at the kitchen table with her laptop, same as always. I set the envelope on the table in front of her, and I said, "I need you to look at this." She opened it slowly. She read the first page, and then she looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger. Shock. Real, unfiltered shock. She said, "Callan, you can't be serious right now." I said, "I'm completely serious. My attorney's contact is on the second page." And I went to the other room. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because it wasn't satisfying the way people might expect. It was heavy. 8 years is heavy. 2 kids is heavy. The version of us that existed at that backyard cookout when we were young and full of ideas, that was heavy to walk away from. But I had already done the walking. I had done it slowly, quietly, over the previous 3 months. By the time I put that envelope on the table, I was already gone. The weeks that followed were difficult in a specific way. Brielle went through phases fast. The first few days she was distant, processing. Then she wanted to talk constantly. She said things like, "I never meant for it to get here," and "I think I lost myself for a while and I took it out on the wrong person." And I believe she meant those things. I do. But meaning something and it being enough are 2 different things. One evening she sat across from me after the kids were in bed and she said, "What if we tried counseling? Real counseling, both of us, not just me." I looked at her and I said, "I think that conversation needed to happen about 3 years ago." She nodded slowly. She didn't argue. I think somewhere in her she knew that too. The legal process took about 4 months. Ohio requires a waiting period, and there were things to work through. The house was the biggest piece. I had been paying the mortgage almost entirely on my own for years, and the financial records reflected that clearly. We reached an agreement that worked. Not perfect for either of us, but honest. The part that mattered most to me was the kids. My attorney had built a strong picture of my involvement, not to attack Brielle, but to reflect reality accurately. The parenting schedule we landed on gave me primary residential custody, with Brielle having consistent time. It matched what had actually been true in our home for years. Nolan took it hard at first. He's the kind of kid who internalizes things. One night about a week after Brielle and I sat them down and explained that we were going to be living in 2 different homes, he came into the kitchen while I was cleaning up and he just stood there for a minute. Then he said, "Dad, are you going to be okay?" 7 years old, and he's asking me that. I crouched down and I said, "Yeah, bud, I really am. And so are you." He hugged me and went back to his room. That one got me. I won't pretend it didn't. Tessa handled it differently, the way she handles everything, with feeling first and questions later. She cried when we told her. She asked if she could still have her room at both houses. I told her yes. She asked if I would still do her hair in the mornings on my days. I told her, every single time. She wiped her face and said, "Okay." 5 years old and more adaptable than most adults I know. Brielle moved into an apartment about 20 minutes away in April. The house stayed with me through the settlement. And here's something I didn't expect. The first morning I woke up in that house alone, kids at Brielle's for the night, it was completely quiet. And I sat with my coffee at the kitchen table, and I didn't feel lonely. I felt like I could breathe. Like the air pressure in the room had changed. Like something that had been sitting on my chest for years had finally been lifted. I hadn't realized how heavy it was until it was gone. I want to be fair about Brielle because this isn't a story about a villain. She's a good mother when she's present. She loves Nolan and Tessa genuinely. But she had built a version of our marriage that served her completely, and she had done it so gradually that neither of us named it until it was the only version left. Her conscious living and intentional mindset. Content, the brand she had been building, it turned out a lot of that confidence had been borrowed from the stability I was providing underneath it. When that stability became her own responsibility to maintain, things got harder for her. I heard through mutual friends that the retreat business slowed down, that some of the clients she had been coaching moved on, that the version of herself she had been selling, the free, unbounded, fully aligned woman, was harder to perform when the logistics of actual life landed entirely on her own plate. I'm not happy about that. I'm really not. But I'm also not surprised. It's easy to talk about energy and flow and conscious abundance when someone else is paying the mortgage and managing the school schedule. About a month after everything was finalized, I ran into her at pickup. The kids ran to me, and I got them settled in the car, and then Brielle walked over. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not dramatic, just real. She said, "You're good with them. You've always been good with them." I said, "Thanks, Brielle." She paused and said, I think I understood too late what I actually had. I looked at her for a moment, and I said, I think you understood exactly when you were ready to. I got in the car. Nolan was telling me about something that happened at school. Tessa was already asking what was for dinner. I pulled out of the parking lot, and I felt present in a way I hadn't in years. Not perfect, not healed completely, but present. It's been about 7 months since the papers were signed. I wake up early, I make lunches, I do the school runs, I work my 40+ hours. I come home and my house feels like mine. On the weekends, the kids are with me. The three of us have figured out our own rhythm. We cook together on Saturdays, badly, but together. Nolan started opening up more. Tessa still asks me to do her hair every single morning, and I do it every single time. I'm not going to tell you I have everything figured out or that I landed in some perfect chapter of my life. I don't think that's how real life works. What I will tell you is this. I spent years being the foundation of something that didn't value foundations. And the moment I stopped pouring myself into it, I finally had something left for the people who actually needed me. That's enough. For right now, that's more than enough.
It's interesting how distance doesn't always start with space. Sometimes it just grows in silence between people. You can feel when something shifts, even if nothing obvious happens. Maybe the only thing worth holding on to is clarity about what you're giving and what you're actually getting back. And if that balance feels off for too long, it's probably okay to quietly choose yourself a little more.